Right, greetings to everybody and welcome to this webinar. Oh, sorry, just did that. The slides just disappeared as I said that. Yeah, thank you, Vivek. Well, welcome to this webinar. My name's Chris Brett. I'm the lead agribusiness specialist, and I'd like to just to set the scene. We've been running a series of webinars over the last year under what we call the Aquainvest platform, which has been established at the World Bank to support smallholder, medium enterprise, and even large-scale investments across the agricultural sector. Just by way of introduction today, we're going to be looking at the guidelines for sustainable agribusiness development that we're working with in collaboration with Advance Africa. So I'll come on to introduce that in just a moment. But just to kick off and start and say thank you and welcome to everyone for joining. Please do feel free just to put your name in the chat, your organization, where you're connecting from. And of course, as we go forward and you're listening to the presentations that are going to be given, please do put any questions in the chat. Our objective is to, of course, engage with the audience and try and make sure that we answer as many questions and create some conversation across our panelists. So just as by way of introduction, the Aquainvest platform that we've set up has been funded by a World Bank trust fund called ProBlue. We have 5 major components within this program. So component 1 is looking at the investment climate and opportunities. And I'll explain a little about the partners we work for as well as we go forward. So here we're looking at national and regional studies to assess readiness for investments from the World Bank Group. And when I say the World Bank Group, we're looking at the World Bank, which is myself. I work on the public side, but we also work with the International Finance Corporation as well, which works on the private sector side. So we work with IFC, but we also encourage other international financial investments as well, whether it's commercial banks or from development finance as well. And this is all related to, good quality agribusiness value chain investments across the world. We're not limited to Africa. We're not limited at all. We're completely global. The second component I'm going to come to in a moment, but the third component is looking at deep dives at country case studies. So far, we've been working in Pakistan and Cabo Verde with this work, and we look at where there are opportunities for investment, where already the World Bank Group or other investments are happening. And then we can look at how we can develop case studies to really develop, a deep dive within the sector. And of course, coming out of that deep dive, where are the opportunities for investment? And the whole theme of what we're talking about today is investment, good quality investment in the aquaculture, aquabusiness space. The other area that we look at, and this is working with the International Finance Corporation, we've set up a fund to support early movers as advisory services with IFC. This is where the International Finance Corporation has clients that are working in the aquaculture space. They might not necessarily be ready for investment yet, but they're preparing that journey. So we can give advisory support to a limited number of clients that IFC has really focused on. The fifth component here is very much about the study we've done on markets, seaweed markets. We're just releasing in the next few days a report that we've just completed on global seaweed markets, new and emerging opportunities. And this is looking at 10 specific investment areas around the seaweed, which we see as short, medium and long-term opportunities for investors. And of course, bringing to countries, not just the investment, but also the opportunity for technology transfers, the opportunity for job creation, of course, gender inclusion as well. And also we look at all of these investments through the lens related to climate change, climate mitigation. So we have a lot going on in this space. And today I'm delighted to bring around our discussions with Advance Africa, who have taken on this assignment to actually develop aquabusiness, to develop the aquabusiness guidelines that that are under preparation. They started this work a few months ago. We're really delighted to collaborate with them. So we're going to look at really the work that they're doing, their thinking, and how they go forward. But I'm going to start the conversation sorry, my computer's going a bit slow, with Fred Formanak, the co-founder and managing member partner of Advance Africa. And to say we've been delighted to be working with Advance Africa as our lead consultants in this space. And I really wanted to, introduce this conversation Yeah, with Fred, I mean, there's a lot of experience here, but I really wanted to get it right from Fred, right from the boss. Fred, you know, you've been in this game for quite some time. You've looked at a lot of investments, but what I really want to get a little snapshot from you. You know, what do you see as the main constraints for investors to come into this space? Over to you, Fred.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, and welcome to all the participants in this webinar. Thank you to the World Bank and thank you, ProBlue, for arranging this. I think it's very exciting. It's an extremely exciting project for us, and I think a very meaningful one for global aquaculture. Yeah, to get straight into your question, key factors of evaluation for us primarily surround identifying natural strategic advantage. Therein, we believe, lies true sustainability. Natural strategic advantage in a number of different areas, definitely in environmental conditions, quality of the water body, issues such as avoidance of pollutants, geographic location being a second critical aspect, which also encompasses aspects such as distance to high quality seed stock, distance to high quality feed, distance to market. So geographic location being a critical factor. Human capital is undoubtedly a key factor, both in quality and experience of management, as well as workforce experience, training, accessibility to it. The source of funding, equally critical. Aquaculture is definitely not a quick profit type business. Patient capital is definitely required. So the quality of the funding, the type of funding that is secured is of great importance. And I'd say probably as a key fifth factor, what we look at, the regulatory environment and the political will for the investment. So Chris, those to us, natural strategic advantage needs to be evident in the investment, and without it, the chances of success are limited.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fred. I just wanted to also say, you know, as we go on this journey, you know, working on these guidelines, a lot of the work the World Bank does is actually building, you know, a pipeline of investable opportunities. We do a lot of work in finance, obviously, we do a lot of work in the public sector and the private sector. But when we work with local banks, you know, this isn't about just the development finance, but we work with local banks to try and get them to actually invest and support these sectors. But they're always complaining that there is not a good pipeline, there's not a proven business model, there's a high risk within this sector. So I'm hoping that with the work we're doing with you guys is going to help sort of like bring a little bit of de-risking around that as we professionalize that sector. So let's start this presentation. Let me introduce the project team. Vivek, if you could put the slide up on the project team. I'll introduce the slide, then I'll hand over for the presentation. Let me just introduce the team. So obviously, you've already met me, Chris Brett, the lead agribusiness specialist. My other colleagues that are very strong in working on this is Dr. Harrison Carissa and Ruth Garcia Gomez. The three of us are working under the World Bank side and really strongly leading this process, you know, with other colleagues, with other consultants as well. We just met Fred, you know, on this discussion. We've also got Professor Tom Hecht as well, the head of fisheries as well, and fisheries and agriculture from Advanced Africa. He'll be speaking a little bit later on. We're going to be handing over to Jim in a moment just to open up, who's a senior consultant and the consulting division manager. And we've also got Brett Pringle, a consultant, and Rachel Mullins, a consultant. So we've got a very strong team from Advanced Africa, and we'll be looking from hearing from them. So let me hand over now to Jim and ask everyone, please, you know, think questions. Let's keep the debate going. We'll run the presentations through and then we'll go to the questions. So next slide, please, and over to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. I'm just going to provide some background on Advance Africa and what we do in this space. So we have 5 core areas of expertise. We work in the aquaculture, fisheries, agriculture, data and environment space. Our clients include governments, institutions, development agencies, and the private sector. Now, in terms of the aquaculture space, we work, it's multifaceted work. So we work in aquaculture governance, which includes looking at legislation, policies, and regulations, as well as drafting these. We also put together guidelines for sustainable aquaculture. Another big focus of ours is sectoral planning on a country level, including master planning. We also do applied science in the space. So this looks at designing and implementing scientific research programs. We also have developed early stage infrastructure to support the sector, such as R&D facilities and hatcheries. And a big focus of ours is also skills development and capacity building. In terms of our work with the private sector, a lot of this involves determining where the business opportunities are. We conduct scoping and feasibility studies, business planning. We also do research and development, as well as market and value chain assessments. I think the key thing that sets Advance Africa apart is the fact that we look at the entire life cycle of a project. So from concept through assessing feasibility to implementation and incubation. So we not only provide consulting services, but we have hands-on experience in actually developing aquaculture projects from the design phase through to fundraising, project market development, and actually managing the facility. So because of this, we actually have a very good understanding of the key success factors that will drive aquaculture investment and growth. And I think that that's particularly relevant for this assignment. Thanks. Next slide, please. So just some context for the assignment. Aquaculture is, a rapidly growing sector. It's the fastest growing food sector globally for the last 30 years. This is largely a result of advancements in things such as production technologies, fish health, husbandry, and genetics. And this has enabled diversification and intensification of the aquaculture industry. What we're expecting is that aquaculture will continue on its upward trajectory with increasing population growth, as well as urbanization, and expanding middle income class, increasing facilitation of trade. So we expect the growth of aquaculture to continue. Next slide, please. The sector is not without its risks and challenges. Globally, I think we can all agree that the sector hasn't quite reached its full potential. It still faces a number of challenges and risks, and these relate to things such as governance. In many cases, there's inadequate policy or legislation, and a lack of cooperation or a clear understanding of the roles of the private and public sectors. Climate is a big one. Often there's a lack of innovation and fit for purpose technology, and operations have little adaptive capacity. Disease and biosecurity is a major issue globally. Human capacity, as Fred touched on, we often find that there's a shortage of core skills. Financial challenges, including things such as lack of financing mechanisms, and a general lack of awareness in the financial services sector around aquaculture. And the key one, which I think is often underestimated, is knowledge. Aquaculture is a fairly a new or novel thing to many people, and in that way, it's actually a key constraint to driving investment. So I think that this is why this assignment is highly relevant and timely, because a key priority now is trying to understand and implement best practices and to ensure that this can drive sustainable growth going forward. Next slide, please. So Chris touched on the Aquainvest platform, just to provide some briefly some context of where the guidelines fit in. The guidelines essentially are trying to answer a few different questions, such as, what are the ingredients for a vibrant aquaculture investment climate? What should aquaculture developers look for? What should government and the private sector do, and how should they collaborate? How do prospective investors determine what species to farm and where? What are the planning activities and the type of analytics required? And things looking such as at long-term viability of aquaculture in the face of climate change. Next slide, please. So there are already a number of existing frameworks and guidelines for promoting sustainable aquaculture. Various FAO instruments such as the Ecosystems Approach to Aquaculture, a variety of national and regional BMPs and standards, as well as voluntary BMPs and certifications. All of these are largely underpinned by the FAO Ecosystems Approach. Next slide, please. In terms of where these guidelines fit in and how they differ, the idea is not to duplicate or reinvent these existing frameworks. We acknowledge that they have a place in promoting sustainable aquaculture. We plan to rather build on these frameworks and with a specific focus on guiding investment and business development. The goal is to create a sort of go-to platform which is accessible and user-friendly and provides a guide for investment-related questions. And in sum, these guidelines will provide a framework of principles for developing aquabusinesses for use by stakeholders at all levels. Thank you. I will now hand over to Brett, and he's going to take us through the methodology that will be applied in developing the guidelines.
Thanks very much, Jim. Vivek, do you mind going to the next slide? Thank you. Yeah, so thanks again, Jim. Good morning and afternoon to everyone. Thanks again for joining. I'll be going through the aim, scope, and audience of the project. So Jim alluded to a few of these points already, but just to reiterate, the overall aim of the project is to develop a set of user-friendly and practical guidelines that present the necessary requirements and enabling factors which investors should consider when making an investment in aquaculture, and importantly, a responsible and sustainable investment. So this means the investment is feasible, environmentally friendly, socially acceptable, and profitable or economically viable. Next slide, please. So in terms of the scope, the project is global, with a focus on extracting key learnings from the successes and failures in Asia, Africa, and South and Central America, while still covering the remaining regions. The guidelines will also be applicable to all species, all production systems and scales throughout the aquaculture value chain. As with the scope, the audience is also broad and will be applicable to both the public and private sectors. In specific cases, we will look at the public sector, so government departments, policymakers, and how they can create an enabling environment for investment. For the private sector, so businesses, farmers, operators, we will assess the requirements for attracting investment. And then for investors, so banks, investment firms, holding companies, we will provide guidance on how to invest responsibly and what factors they should consider. For other stakeholders, so NGOs, farmer associations, and research institutions, we will look at where their support is needed and in what capacity. Next slide, please. In terms of the phases and the approach, so we're currently in the first phase of the project, so we don't have any definitive set of guidelines yet. In the current development phase, where we review the context for developing the guidelines, we're being as inclusive and participatory as possible. In the next phase, we will move on to preparing the guidelines and thereafter validating and disseminating these, with the end goal of having a final product that is a living document which will be available online and maintained by the Aquabusiness or the Aquainvest platform. And this will be updated as new learnings arise. Next slide, please. In terms of the review process, so this is the current phase that we're in. This is a threefold exercise, which includes a comprehensive desktop-based review. So this is of all frameworks, literature, existing guidelines, best management practices, white papers. The second component is stakeholder engagements, and the third is site visits to relevant operations. And throughout these three components, we'll be reviewing and assessing various case studies from around the world to provide more practical findings, which is a really key component of this work that Jim mentioned. The findings of these three components will form the information for gap analysis, which we're currently conducting. And this will be to identify specific gaps in the existing frameworks and guidelines, as well as identify successes and failures and learnings related to business and investment in aquaculture. Next slide, please. So in terms of our stakeholder engagements, as I mentioned, we're trying to be as really participatory and inclusive as possible by talking to stakeholders throughout the sector. So, for example, we've spoken to investors, NGOs, national departments, policymakers, etc. To date, we've conducted several in-person engagements. These have taken place in Kenya, where we discussed investment with farmer associations, technical institutions, farmers and government departments around Lake Victoria and the coast. We've also been to Lesotho, where we spoke to trout farmers on Katsi Dam. We've recently been to the Seychelles, where we engaged with a range of industry stakeholders, and obviously South Africa, which is home to us. So we've had the opportunity to engage with several farmers, associations, and researchers. Rachel's also recently returned from a 2-week visit to Southeast Asia, where she engaged with a range of public and private sector stakeholders. This was in Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia. As you can see in the right there, there's some nice pics from Rachel's visit. There's a seaweed farm in the top left and a grouper farm in the bottom right. We're also planning on other trips to regions we haven't been to yet. So, for example, we'll be in Europe later this year. We'll be in Zambia in November, attending the World Aquaculture Society Africa Chapter Conference in Lusaka. And then early next year, we'll be visiting South and Central America, as well as South Asia. We're also continually meeting with stakeholders virtually. I can't remember the number, but we're in the 30s and 40s in the number of stakeholder engagements we've had virtually. And yeah, so that's it from me. I'll hand over to Rachel, who will walk us through some practical examples of how these guidelines can be used. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. As Brett said, I'll be walking us through some practical examples of using the guidelines. So firstly, it's just important to note that as Brett went through the review process, through the process that we're using to approach this assignment, we are still in the review stage. We're setting the scene for developing the guidelines. So the guidelines themselves haven't been developed yet, but through the process of setting the scene, of identifying best practices, challenges, lessons, we've come up with a few ideas of what the key themes are that a guideline could be structured around and how those guidelines would actually be used, just to give you a better understanding of using the guidelines. Thank you, Vivek. All right, so the first example I'm going to present you with, the key theme here would be ensuring social responsibility in your aquaculture investment. So with a specific focus on social safeguards. The rationale behind this as a key theme is that in often cases, investor is from a developing country, and investors are from a developed country investing into a developing country, and the social safeguards that are the norm in the investor country are not always the same as those in recipient countries, and the recipient countries don't always have social safeguards in place that are up to scratch with international standards. For example, if a country that's receiving aquaculture investment doesn't have suitable customary rights laws in place that are enforced, there's always the risk that an investment into that region could result in certain groups being marginalized or evicted from their land. So the idea of this guideline is this guideline theme is that it could guide users in investing responsibly in aquaculture and avoiding such risks. So, for example, as an investor looking to invest into aquaculture, the way the guidelines could guide them is firstly how to assess the social safeguards that are in place in a country that the investor is going into. So outlining what it is that they need to look for, such as labor laws that outline decent work requirements, that define child labor and mitigate child labor, and then the customary law rights that I mentioned, as well as enforcement. So the idea would be for the guideline to be very practical to explain how they would go about looking at those factors. Another way that such a guideline could assist investors is down at the individual investment level, for example, a farm that they want to invest in, to guide the investor how they'd go about assessing the investment and whether it is responsible from a social safeguards perspective. So, for example, this might be through a third-party audit or certification process. And then on the other hand, the guidelines would provide an outline for the public sector of how to go about putting those social safeguards in place to make the investment environment more attractive. So, for example, the guidelines could outline lessons learned from countries that do have good examples of these social safeguards and how it is that the public sector could strengthen those in their country. The next example, you can go on to the next slide. I'm going to hand over to Brett to introduce this second example that we have prepared.
Thanks, Rachel. So this example focuses on the relationship between an investor and the investee or company. And in this case, we want to advise farmers or investors and even the public sector on how best to establish a formal financial relationship that benefits both parties. And this is obviously important if we want to ensure full transparency between the parties and ultimately in the long term have success and show that there's potential for intensification of scale. So here we're looking at, for example, joint ventures, public-private partnerships, shared equity models, and so forth, which all have varying applications and levels of implementation. So, for example, an aquaculture conglomerate that we have been engaging with in Thailand, mostly around shrimp, they use contract farming with individual operators. And then on the other hand, the IFC, which is part of the World Bank Group, have used quasi-equity, which is a blend between investment equity and debt. And they typically work with large corporate companies. So in the case of IFC, this allows the company that they're investing in to establish themselves and not have to pay back debt yearly or monthly, as we see in traditional financing and loans. So these are just some examples that work for different entities. And by outlining these relationships at different levels in the guidelines, the users or anyone accessing the guidelines can understand which options are available and suitable to their situation. I'll now hand over to Jim to give us a climate smart example.
Jim, you're muted.
You're muted, Jim.
Apologies. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, climate is a major risk, and I think yesterday was the hottest day ever recorded. So I think now that we're aware of the problem, one of the important things is that from the outset, potential investors or operators must look at implementing proactive measures rather than retroactive measures. So, for example, in the picture here, this is an abalone farm in South Africa. These operators from the outset, in their conceptual design, considered the need to incorporate climate smart infrastructure and technologies. And in this case, this was wind and solar energy. And I think for prospective investors, it's important to assess the climate resilience of operations by looking at things such as vulnerability to cyclones, sea level rise, and drought. And additionally, prospective investors should assess the capacity of the operation to build in climate smart technologies and innovations. Equally, private sector operators, they need to consider how they can make their operations adaptable to incorporate new climate smart technology to mitigate against the risk. I will now hand over to Tom Hecht, who will present a slide on the importance of aquaculture zoning.
Thank you very much, Jim, and good afternoon and good morning to everybody, and hello to old friends. I see there are very, very, very many of them in our audience. One of the important things that we take into account also is the promotion of zoning to attract and simplify investment. Aquaculture zoning, or as we call them, aquaculture development zones, they allow for investors to readily identify opportunities. In fact, opportunities have been pre-identified to a very large extent. And the object of such zoning exercises is to remove the barriers and obviously to address issues of user conflict, which arise everywhere where aquaculture operations or new aquaculture operations are being developed. So it is a task of the public sector to undertake such an assessment of possible aquaculture zones. And just to give you an example, on the figure on the right-hand side is a picture of Mahe Island in the Seychelles, where we undertook such an exercise. And I'd just like to run through some of the things that we took into consideration in the identification of these zones. The zones for aquaculture are the yellow zones that you see on that particular slide. And the issues that we took into consideration, for example, includes social issues such as yachting passages and scuba dive sites, for example. Ecological issues such as distance from coral reef and the avoidance of eelgrass beds. This allows for the development of exclusion zones or minimum distance zones. We also looked at traditional fishing grounds, like, for example, the trap fisheries around the island, shipping lanes, physical and chemical ocean conditions such as currents, river discharge, sewage discharge, and of course, infrastructure accessibility, which on the Seychelles, well, it doesn't really come into play because everything is so small. But nevertheless, by looking at all these issues and then collating all this information, we were able to come up with these aquaculture development zones, and it certainly has resulted in reduction of user conflict. Often these zones are also associated with incentives for investors, and they offer opportunities for development of components of other value chain hubs, for example, hatcheries and processing facilities and export facilities. And overall, we are of the opinion that zoning, for example, in small island developing states, very important. Also in the development of industrial development zones globally, they play a role. And then also for inland aquaculture along large African lakes, say, for example. So this is just to give you an idea as to the importance of looking at zonation for aquaculture development. And I'll pass you on to Rachel, I think.
Thanks very much, Prof. The last example of a guideline we're going to speak about is relating to biosecurity risks and the outbreak of disease. Through the engagements we've had, it comes up very often that in a practical sense, biosecurity and disease are often a major reason for failures in aquaculture investment, even if various other factors are in place. So given the importance of this, there are various different types of guidelines that could come out of this key theme, and there are guidelines across the value chain. For example, the guidelines could guide the public sector towards, as Prof explained in the previous slide, the importance of zonation and identifying and enforcing carrying capacities. This is particularly important in shared or transboundary water bodies to avoid the transfer of disease from one operation to the other. As is the case with climate change, as Jim mentioned, prevention rather than cure. Very important that public sectors invest in epidemiological surveillance programs, as this makes an industry a lot more attractive because the risk of biosecurity is mitigated. At the same time, public sector can also invest in diagnosis and treatment services and capacity building, and most importantly, that these should be timely with regards to response from the moment that something is detected to it being diagnosed and appropriately treated, rather than before it spreads to a whole farm or a whole water body. And then at the same time, developing national biosecurity protocols to avoid the entry of pathogens and disease. There's also the opportunity for investors or private sector to avoid and treat biosecurity risks in a similar way by investing in diagnosis and treatment, by establishing stringent biosecurity protocols, and then on top of that, ensuring contingency planning and emergency planning in the case that outbreaks do occur, whether on their farm or other farms, that result in trade bans for their country. So there are various different guidelines that could come out of this theme and various different ways that they could be made practical. But those are some of the ways that the public and private sector could use the guidelines to understand how to mitigate biosecurity risks. Just an example that led us to developing this as a key theme. The pictures on the right show the Mobi Lab in Hanam province in Vietnam. So that's a joint innovation between the National University of Agriculture, a private company called VMC Animal Health, and the Vietnam Sea Culture Association. They respond quickly to reports from farmers about mortalities and explain mortalities in their system. They go and offer a free diagnosis service, and from there the farmers can treat their ponds or their systems effectively and timeously, rather than potentially either waiting for a diagnosis service which might come too late, or just treating indiscriminately because they're not sure what the problem is with their system. All right, that's the last of our examples. I'd like to just, if we could go on to the next slide, just to explain the next steps. So this is just a repeat of what Brett showed you. As he said, we're now in the process of reviewing the context for sustainable aquabusiness development. Once we reach the end of this phase, we'll move on to actually preparing these guidelines. We'll then go through a validation process of the guidelines, and then we will begin disseminating them to various audiences. And if we can go on to the next slide, I would just, we would like to thank very much all the stakeholders that we've engaged with so far. This is just a list of some of the stakeholders we have met with. There are various other stakeholders that we have meetings scheduled with or engagements scheduled with, and then others who we still do intend to reach out to. Many of the stakeholders on that list are from my recent visit to Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, who are all very, very hospitable, and I appreciate the time that everyone's taken to meet with us and share their insights that will be important for developing these guidelines. So thank you very much. We can move on. And so that's our contact information. You can also access the Advance Africa website through the QR code on the screen. We look forward to receiving your questions during this webinar, during the Q&A session that's coming up, but that's also a way you can contact us if you have any other questions after the webinar wraps up, or if you want to reach out to us with potentially having a meeting regarding your insights into the guidelines. Thank you very much from all of us.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an incredibly smooth team effort, I have to say. You very seamlessly passed the baton, as we put it, between each other. So thank you so much. It's created, one or two questions that I'm seeing coming through, but I'm just really encourage people to put more questions in. I just want to ask you, Rachel, straight away. You were finishing on biosecurity.
Yes.
We at the World Bank have really been concerned about the high mortality rates, on a lot of the systems that we're seeing across Africa and Asia. In your opinion, what sort of percentage of losses are, the small, medium enterprises really facing realistically? Do you have any idea?
I'm going to pass you over to Tom to maybe give you an idea, but what I will add before I do that is one of the key lessons that came out of my trip to Southeast Asia, where biosecurity, I think probably mainly due to the fact that shrimp is such a commonly farmed species there, but where biosecurity was a very common theme in all of the engagements I had. There's also quite a strong focus on a move towards sustainable intensification. So, for example, I met with one of the biggest shrimp farmers globally, one of the biggest shrimp farmers, and they have said that they are moving away quite strongly from their intensive high stocking density systems towards more extensive, for example, rice culture systems. Even though they're one of the biggest operators, they found that in the slightly less intensive systems, they're far more efficient because the mortalities are so much lower. I did hear from some of my conversations, I was told comparisons of stocking densities before and stocking densities after interventions like that. But I unfortunately can't remember those numbers offhand, and I wouldn't want to give you the wrong number. But Tom can perhaps elaborate on that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Tom. It's something that we get asked quite a bit. And I just thought as you go on these journeys now, we talk about biosecurity risk. It's something that you hear a very broad range of numbers. But if you can give us any facts on that, that'd be really useful.
Very, very, very difficult question, Chris. How long is a piece of string? Mortalities in certain instances can be catastrophic. Say, for example, with SRS in Chile in some years. So, and in other instances, mortalities are very low, and some as a consequence of bacterial diseases, but with good management, obviously these are controlled. I would either say that in the last 10 years we have seen major advances in terms of improved animal husbandry and improved nutrition that has contributed very much to the reduction of mortalities. But as I said, it's very difficult to give you an average sort of number.
No, that's fine. That's good to know. We got a question from a colleague here with IFC, asking really about as you do this work, are you trying to align? And I'm a bit embarrassed to say how old these guidelines are. He's talking about the 2007 we've got a question here. Let me just read the question out to you and see if it's possible to answer at this stage. Otherwise, we'll come back on it. Well, it's a question on the World Bank Health Environmental Social Guidelines 2007 to aquaculture. Have you had a chance to revise those yet? I'm not sure if we've sent them to you. Have you seen those yet at all in your system? The aquacultural guidelines, it says, how will these aquaculture guidelines interact with the World Bank Group EHS guidelines for aquaculture in 2007? Is that relevant to you yet? Have you had a chance to look at those?
Thanks, Chris. We certainly have been in the process of collating as many as possible. In terms of the IFC, the meetings that we've had so far, the standards that came up, I think, were from 2000 or 2001, which we've considered thus far. But certainly, I mean, the whole idea is to really do a very comprehensive review of all of these frameworks. As I mentioned, we're not trying to duplicate at all, but where we can look for synergies between them, we certainly will.
Yeah, no, what I've been very surprised at, as you've been bringing information together, I mean, we also discussed with FAO on some of the information related to social issues, particularly child labour, as Rachel referred to. I'm surprised how old quite a lot of these guidelines are from the international institutions like us and others as well. So it's something that we need to really look at as a bit of a refresh, with our what we call our basically our social safeguards teams as we do this work as well. So that's something to really look at and to consider. I mean, while I've got you there, Jim, I mean, as you've been doing this work, over quite a long period of time, and I'm really encouraged actually, because you're not just consultants in terms of all the reviews and works. You're getting quite down in there into the actual business models and so on. So what do you see as the key risks at the moment of the typical aquaculture investments?
I think, Chris, it's very much dependent on a few things, such as species, location, and system. I think from a macroeconomic perspective, there's quite a few risks which are obviously very difficult to mitigate, such as what's happening in Ukraine, for example, or pandemics. Some of the key risks, I believe, and I think it's often neglected, is a lack of skills and capacity. Aquaculture can be quite a technical subject matter. People are often attracted by the idea of fish farming and potentially high returns. But what we've seen widely is generally, and from the stakeholders we've consulted with, is this need for skills development. I mean, at all levels. So from governments down to smallholder farmers, for example. I think without those skills, the risk is that, and this includes aspects such as even financial literacy, for example, or business planning. I think without those skills and without that knowledge, it's very difficult to turn operations from, say, a sort of a subsistence type model into something that can truly grow into a private sector led operation. For me, that's one of the major risks. I mean, there are quite a few others that we've touched on. But yeah, that's one of the standout things, and I think that's why these guidelines it's very timely that they're coming along now.
No, I really appreciate that. Let me just ask you a question here that's come up as well. Will you be addressing natural habitat and biodiversity risk aspects, e.g. the use of non-native invasive species? Is that part of the guidelines?
Absolutely. I mean, it's also a critical issue. If I think about, for example, let's look at the case of South Africa. And tilapia is a very good example. Nile tilapia, which is the best performing tilapia species, is not native to large parts of South Africa. And this has constrained, in many ways, the growth of the freshwater aquaculture industry if we compare it to countries such as Zambia or countries north of South Africa. So it's definitely an important factor. It's something that is being addressed. But I mean, that's just one example. There's several others where it's going to be critical to understand what are the opportunities in certain areas where species are, you're not allowed to grow them. What are the sort of the cost benefits of going ahead with the species? Is it allowed within a regulatory framework? If not, how does one look at native species, for example? Is there potential to go ahead with native species? In many examples, they don't perform as well. So an investor will have to consider that. But it's certainly something that we will include in the guidelines.
Thanks very much. I'm quite fascinated. There's a colleague here, Daniel Segura of Mozambique. I was trying to message him to ask if I could call him out, because what's good about these webinars, we get fascinating people who connect and with not just to learn from us, but also have knowledge as well. I'm not sure, Daniel, are you able to come online? Because I'd like to know,
Sure.
you're the manager of a matching grant program founded by the World Bank, of course, and with a budget of $21 million, we have a window of aquaculture companies up to 0.5. I mean, if you're there, Daniel, can you give us any experiences you've had? And I mean, I'd be really keen to hear what's gone right, but also what has been challenging or gone wrong from you. Feel free to speak. Are you there, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you copy me?
Great, thank you. I can hear you well. Yeah, it'd be great if you could give us some of your experiences, just so we're, at this point in the webinar. Over to you, Daniel.
Yeah, awesome. I think that I'm gonna talk about challenges first because we overcome a lot of them and we still are overcoming a lot of them, to be honest. First, how we can help private sector to have business plan that were presented by the private sector were not like really good, the standards, quality, and so we needed to allocate consultants to help them to figure it out how to develop this business plan, how to develop all the safeguards component that were that we needed and the World Bank was asking for. The other thing that was a challenge is how to involve community within those business plans. And the big one that we're having right now, those business plans that were financed through a matching grant scheme, so we co-finance them, how we can help them now to grow and be credit ready. And that is how we can link those to commercial banks and how we can link those to other financial lines. So we are talking here even about doing blended finance. We are talking about parametrical insurance. As you know, Mozambique is really affected by cyclones and mostly all the agriculture is down along the coast. So now that is one of the main challenge. And for not talking about the quality of fingerlings and the quality of feed. Those two things are like the two main things that are jeopardizing a little bit the future of agriculture for Mozambique right now. So we are trying to do our best. We are also trying to diversify a little bit when it comes to species. So from now, right now we are financing a sea cucumber facility. We are financing another pilot on the north for seaweed, but mostly we are doing tilapia. Okay, because we are linking one of the programs is linked to food security, so that's why we're doing tilapia. The other one is more linked to innovation in private sector, and we are doing that with diversification of the species. Mostly that is, but I will share with you some of the videos of our projects on the chat, and feel free to even address any questions. Maybe we can even share a short presentation of our matching grant and requirements and so on. But for us in Mozambique, the main challenge is how to involve the community and how to help private sector to be more private sector driven, more business driven. Because as you were saying, mostly all of the people want to get into agriculture because they think they're gonna earn a lot of money. They do not have the technical skill. They do not invest in technical capability of the communities and technical capability of their own technicians. So that is how we are. Those are kind of the challenges that we are finding.
No, thank you very much, Daniel. That's really useful. I just wanted to bring you in because I was quite fascinated with your comment there. And I had heard of the Mozambique Fund as part of the work we've been doing on aquaculture, because we're looking for those kind of examples. And, this is very, very practical now as well. It's good. We're getting quite a few questions coming in. Let me just say, I'm not sure, I won't target them specifically to you colleagues in Advanced Africa. Pick it up if you want to take it. I mean, there's a lot of debate, and this happens a lot in the World Bank group as well, about fish feed and locally available cultural species. There's a good question here about linking to West Africa. At times, availability and access are determined by microeconomic factors and context specific. But there's a question here specifically about feed and fish feed and locally available cultural species, affecting the growth in, it says in West Africa, but I'm sure it's affecting the whole of Africa. I'm not sure if one of our colleagues here from Advanced Africa can pick up this question, related to feed. Can we develop local feed value chains linked to local mills, or are we still very import dependent on fish feed? I know this relates also to work we're doing on poultry, actually, but I'm not sure if anyone would like to come in and answer that.
Tom, I think you might have some opinions there.
Yeah, on the local availability of feed, this is something which obviously affects the competitiveness hugely of the industry as well.
Again, that's a very complex question. If we say, for example, take a niche product such as abalone, and South Africa, I think, is around about the third largest producer of farmed abalone. The feed that is used here is locally produced using mainly local ingredients. That again is a function of available knowledge, available technology, which in several other countries, say for example in Southern Africa, does not exist. So while there might be sufficient local produce to produce such feeds, there could be, say for example, a lack of technology, number one, a lack of finances to set up feed mills, number two, but then again, number three, it depends on the scale of the operations. If, say, for example, we take Zambia, we have recently had 3 major feed companies, in fact, 3 of the largest players in the world, that have set up factories in Zambia, and that's simply a matter of the scale of the emerging tilapia farming sector in Lake Kariba. So yes, there are great opportunities for the manufacture of local feeds, but it depends to a very large extent on the scale of aquaculture in that particular area or region.
No, thanks very much, Tom. There's a few more questions coming in, but I see a very polite hand up from someone. It's not me, someone else called Chris. Chris, you want to come in? Or is it hang on down? Sorry, Chris. Well, okay. Well, we know each other well.
Yeah, it's Chris Dennis. I'm the CEO of the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, and I just wanted to give or share a little anecdote from a recent visit I had to Iceland. I know maybe not a lot of similarities with production systems in Africa, but this question about why isn't there local feed mill capacity in Iceland when you consider that from some of the most sustainable fisheries in the sort of northeast Atlantic, Icelandic vessels are catching the raw marine ingredients, at least they're being exported to feed mills outside of Iceland, and then the feed is being re-imported back to Iceland to feed the growing salmon and sea trout industry there, and there are big plans for expansion. And this question was posed to the big sort of feed producers at this conference I attended, and they talked roughly about needing a demand of around 100,000 tons of feed to make a venture based in Iceland worthwhile, to make financial sense. So it's a number based on that, based on production in Iceland, but at least it's a number that we could sort of further debate, I guess. Thank you.
No, thanks very much, Chris. Second time I think I've seen you today. You were in that other meeting earlier on as well, so good to see you. Also, I respect the comment here very strongly from Amy Lindsay about permitting process of registering feeds and feed ingredients. This is something that hopefully, as we come out through developing these guidelines and we look at these areas of regulations and policy, we have to really work very strongly, as a World Bank, and the World Bank does an awful lot of work on advocacy, policies, regulations across different industries. And we are really looking at a deep dive now across the policies and regulations related to animal feeds in poultry, as well as animal feed, of course, in aquaculture, because these are key areas to, number one, make the system work, investable, but also to make systems very competitive as well. So this is something that we have to really give some good thoughts at and really look into as well. There's still a couple of other questions coming in. I see some debate going on different areas. I just wanted to sort of explain also from the World Bank's point of view, we're also very focused on quite a lot of work in Indonesia, and we've been working on a program. And it's on. I'll drop it in the chat box in a second. It's called AgResults. This is where we use a program to actually incentivize private sector engagement, within smallholders SME systems. And we've really identified quite a champion in Indonesia that we've been working with, a private sector company called eFisheries. And I think that they've got a very, very interesting model where they work with farmers renting equipment. So the farmers develop the ponds, and then the ponds, of course, the fingerlings go in the ponds, and then they've got these aerators that also distribute feed within the pond. So the feeding system goes around the pond dispersing food or feed for the animal, to the fish, as well as, of course, aerating the ponds. These have been really, really strong and an interesting model. So we picked that one up through a lot of early operations and early investments that we've done at the bank as well. And just to say, that also links with the whole digital agenda, because a lot of the producers, they program the aerator and the feeding system, through mobile phones, and it can be quite automated. These are important areas. So that company has developed a model of supplying, the aerator stroke feeding unit, as well as selling the feed to the producer as well. So that's kind of interesting service stroke feed, to a producer system. So there's a lot of new emerging systems coming out as well. I'm just looking through some of the questions here. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to drop any more questions in the guidelines, or feel free to come in any comments as well. But I've got here one. I mean, it's an interesting question that was sent to me sort of just directly as well. I'll go to Jim or Rachel, or Brett, of course, maybe more focused on Brett actually. Will the guidelines take into account the role of informal financing? We talk about trying to build credit worthiness, but there's a lot of informal financing within these systems. Is there anything that we can say on that comment as well? We've heard from Daniel talking about his model. We looked at blended finance and so on, matching grants. But anything there you can think about in terms of informal financing within the sector?
Thanks, Chris. I'll have one or two comments, and then I might hand over to Fred. But certainly, I think we see, particularly in Africa, there's a lot of small-scale aquaculture farmers who are really desperate to get into the industry. If we think about Lake Victoria, farmers with 1 or 2 cages, they will struggle to walk into a traditional bank and get a traditional finance or loan, just because aquaculture is in its infancy. Banks see aquaculture as huge risk. So for sure, we definitely will look at options where informal finance can be explored, or how farmers need to approach alternate financiers in different contexts. Fred, I don't know if you have any sort of financial comments there.
Thanks, Brett. To reinforce what you're saying, in developing nations, undoubtedly, informal finance is a critical component to accelerate growth. What I would be interested, though, is if the person who's made that comment can get into direct contact with us. I'd like to hear that person's thoughts and get their input. Thanks.
Let me ask another question here. It's in the chat. During disease occurrence, how can we balance biosecurity and farmers' financial loss? Diseased fish are harvested and sold in local market, leading to the spread of disease. If we disinfect the farms with infected fish, it's going to cost the farmer. What can you suggest to reduce this loss? This is kind of an interesting one, actually. I hadn't realized that this could happen.
Yeah, from my side, it's obviously it's a mechanism to be built in within the funding or the finance mechanism. It's an insurance item, and such compensation needs to be built in within that financial model.
Okay, no other comments. So there's another question here from Roy. It says, what is your take on the role of certification programs in relation to risk management? And is this to be taken into account for investing in aquaculture operations? I think we mentioned some of that in the presentation, but I'm not sure you want to expand more on that.
I'll reinforce that again from my side. Absolutely. Certification is critical, and the alignment between product certification standards and market is traditionally some of the worst failures I've seen is the lack thereof, or the misunderstanding at feasibility stage, that there has to be comprehensive alignment between product, market, and the certification. Some markets are more demanding than others, but gradually the less sophisticated markets are also catching up. So certification can't be overstressed of how important that really is. Certification is critical.
Any other comments from your side, Advanced Africa? Because I've got another question, actually. This is coming from me, actually. It's something that I work on a lot in terms of value chain development, in agriculture or agribusiness, as well as the aquabusiness work. At what extent are we seeing now processes getting integrated into their value chain? Because, we know there's a lot of systems where people produce and they process, but what about the system of an investment and, a processing investment who then outsources production or contracts production through to the SMEs, the farmers? These are the areas that we're very interested in because, it's an inclusive growth model. It can involve, local communities. It can also involve jobs. It can involve youth. Gender is something we haven't talked about yet. That's going to be a very important subject. So are you seeing anything there that's emerging? I'm going to build a processing plant. Then I need to actually then go into procurement. Sorry, Fred, do you want to go ahead on that? Because that's
100% increase in function from what we're experiencing, whether one goes back to the old hub and spoke type language, but 100% that is a model that allows for the entry of far less sophisticated or poorer primary producers, and having control of that is becoming increasingly important in order to achieve the certification. Purely obtaining the certification through such mechanism highly benefits the small scale operators. So it's something we also strongly promote and believe in the context of developing nations.
Okay. Any other comments from your side?
Not from me.
Okay. Then there's another question or comment here about market acceptance and price, at least from a South African. So you should be good on this one. Perspective is a massive constraint regarding the viability of fish farming. The market price for mains in fish has not changed in 4 years. Yeah, operating costs have increased hugely as well. So you see the question there. What comments have we got on that?
Prices are driven by market forces. I mean, at the end of the day, one can't break that equation. I agree that at some of the current prices in South Africa, there are many fish that are completely not viable or feasible, economically feasible to produce. I fully understand that. But will shortages of fish in the natural environment be resolved and improve? No, obviously not. Hence, farmed fish will gradually over time be higher and higher in demand. I think it's back to that question of what investments does one look for. Ultimately, one needs to look for the natural strategic advantage where the species under production can be produced at the most competitive price. And unfortunately, from a risk category, new fish species can displace old fish species in terms of demand and requirement. So, yeah, and I don't see South Africa as a unique case here, but I must agree with the comment that there are many fish that are not worth producing at current market prices.
But a lot of this, of course, will come from, being globally competitive as well. If imports are cheaper, there's a lot of, good quality production in Asia, which is going into, markets all over the world. And we also see huge growth in aquaculture, aqua investments in Europe, particularly Norway and countries like that, producing salmon, tuna, etc. as well. So there's quite a lot going on there. There's this. I was trying to avoid a little bit. There's quite a few questions coming in related to seaweed, and obviously I did say that it's one of the components of this. So just to say to the group here that we will be in the next matter of days, launching our seaweed report. We'll be putting it on LinkedIn. We'll also be putting it on various World Bank sites and distribution, and it will also be on the Aqua Invest platform that we have dropped into the chat box. So keep a lookout for that, and you can sign up for messages from that as well. I just want to ask a question, maybe here to you, Jim. One of the sets of guidelines seeks to help governments create the enabling environment to attract investments. Will such guidelines or guidance help countries ensure value addition instead of just attracting investment, but extract and export? So value addition. Because we do see a lot of seaweed in places like Tanzania and so on being exported in a very raw form. Do you think our, I'm going to say our guidelines, we're on this journey together. Do you think we're going to help local investment?
Absolutely, and that example that you talked about in Kenya, I was there quite recently, and what you see there is exactly that. Very little local retention of value, and we're seeing some interesting initiatives there. So there is some very small scale processing into cosmetic products, for example. But it's something that we've identified for a long time as being an issue with the seaweed industry, is how do we make sure that there isn't such leakage going out where local communities are actually not benefiting as they should from the work they're doing. So that has been something that we are going to consider. And I mean, it's definitely really relevant. I must agree.
No, that's good to hear and very important, because it's something, of course, as a World Bank group, we're constantly looking at, where are the business opportunities around value chains? How do we strengthen that as well? Let me just turn to you as well. We haven't talked about it here, but obviously for us, gender is a very important issue, an important area. So can you tell us, do you see the aquabusiness sector as very, very pro gender, or do you still see it as a very male occupation?
I think it depends on the area, but largely an issue, and it's not only in aquaculture but also in fisheries, is that the contribution of women is often, that they go unheard. Where women have been successfully integrated to some degree is in, I would say, post-harvest. So processing, for example, and trade. But in terms of physical operations, from what we've seen, very, very limited participation of women. But Tom, I'm not sure if you have anything further to add there.
Yeah, it's very difficult. It depends on it can depend on, well, the various issues that it does depend on. I mean, there are cultural issues where in certain, say for example, countries, fishing has traditionally been a male-dominated activity, and to change that or to increase the participation of women has been found to be very difficult. And then it also depends, obviously, on the on what particular section you are working in. You will find, for example, that when it gets to catching and or say the production of fish, it might be very much male dominated, but when it gets to processing, it's approximately close to 100% female. So it's a difficult thing to assess. It varies regionally, it varies by country, it varies by company, but certainly I do believe that there are ways and means in which the participation of women can and should be increased in the aquaculture space.
No, thanks. Let me just ask you guys now as well that, as you're developing this work, you're going to be traveling a lot more. Rachel has just been into the Asia and everything like that. Just give us an example of what kind of a case study do you think you're going to develop? What's the end product of a case study that we'll be including in the guidelines? If you can just give us a little bit of a brief what you're expecting to actually produce there.
Brett?
I think, Jim, you're best placed to answer that.
From our further travels, Sure. I mean, there's a few different case studies. I think we've identified at least 20 or 30. What we're trying to get at with the case studies is we want to try and capture a representative sample. So we're not only looking at big commercial producers who've clearly attracted investment and have achieved critical mass. We're also trying to look at smaller operators and what the success factors there are, or indeed the failings, and what lessons we can learn from those. I think, given that the assignment is global, there are very many different species that are farmed and very many different production systems. So I think we need to be realistic in that regard in terms of exactly how much can be covered. But I think the idea is to essentially get a representative sample and draw on those key findings and key learnings. And I believe by actually going into the field like Rachel did, it's quite amazing how once you're in the field, you see these innovations and what's happening. For example, the Moby Lab that Rachel mentioned, which is a very interesting innovation which could be applied elsewhere.
Well, in the field or in the pond, I'll come to Rachel in a minute. I want to ask Rachel, what was her singularly important learning that she just got from there? But just one question that's coming through also is that will the guidelines also deal with aquaculture for non-food uses? I've got that question sent to me. For example, ornamental. Is there anything there you can add?
Yeah, it'll include issues such as ornamental farming of ornamental fish, marine as well as freshwater. It'll look at issues of seaweed. I mean, seaweed is an absolute classic, where a great proportion of the production is for non-food use, and obviously there are very many other opportunities that will be looked at. They might say, for example, even be a business case for the commercial farming of sponges. So it basically, what I'm saying, non-food use aquaculture will receive as much attention as food aquaculture, because both can make a contribution towards livelihoods.
No, thanks, Tom. This is really important to know, because also it differentiates this product from quite a lot of other products that's been done. It's quite comprehensive around the market. I just want to say to the audience as well is that, I did say in the introduction, we're looking at country level case studies as well in relation to the work we're doing. And I want to stress that when we look at a country level, we've just looked at Cabo Verde and we've looked at Pakistan. And one of the important areas there is about zoning and spatial planning. And we've been working with a company called Longline. And Longline have a very, very interesting model related to carrying capacities, within lakes or carrying capacity within zones, where they can give good advice, not just to governments in terms of permitting, but also to the private sector or to the producers in terms of the most ideal carrying capacity. Because there has been a lot of evidence that in certain areas, people overstock the fish, and overstocking can lead to a lot of these biosecurity issues and can lead to a lot of losses as well. So I just want to say that because we've had a thing about a question came in from Liberia. So I just want to sort of just to answer that question, that Liberia is also a country that we're looking at as a possible case study, and we'll also be looking at aquazonal planning. In that respect. We're also looking at certain other countries as well. I mentioned Cabo Verde, but we're also looking at Cote d'Ivoire as a possible country. The reason being is that the World Bank has got an investment in aquaculture there. So adding on services from these from the support work we're looking at here related to this ProBlue funded trust fund is an opportunity to add value, not just to our investments, but to also be more inclusive in terms of how we can leverage more resources and more investment. We've only got a few minutes left. Let me just quickly ask Rachel, you've been sponsored there on a run around South Asia. And it was really interesting to see quite a lot of your photographs. So just tell us, what was your key learning from that experience?
Thanks, Chris. It's quite hard to narrow it down to one key learning. What I will say that I'm not going to expand on, but that came up in almost every engagement I had and in almost every site I visit, was the issue of biosecurity and disease. But we've spoken about that a lot already today. So what I think was an interesting key theme that came up across my engagements, and that I think is very relevant to this platform, is the importance of knowledge in developing an aquaculture operation and investing in an aquaculture operation. One example was an established farm I visited who just they've not, you know, they're one of the examples of a successful commercial scale farm that there may be lessons to be learned from, and that we hope that a lot of other smaller businesses will learn from those lessons and be pulled up. But basically they're in the expansion phase now, and the capitalization of the expansion phase is going to be a fraction of what it would have been had they included this expansion in the original development. And that basically comes with the knowledge. And so I think that key lesson was having someone knowledgeable on board from the start, because in other examples from state fisheries officers, what I heard was that you know, people will they offer support services, and people will get a bit of money, for example, through a pension, and they'll decide to go into fish farming and invest. And by the time they come to seek assistance from you know, or extension support, it's too late, because issues and challenges that they could have avoided had they had that knowledge have resulted in their investment. It's too late, and the investments have failed. So there are very many lessons and really a lot of interesting things I saw and learned there. But that's probably one that I'd say is key and is applicable across the board. Yeah, in terms of the most interesting and really valuable engagement I had, to see the seaweed farming operations they have off Malaysia was really interesting, and I think we're going to be able to build quite a few case studies out of that as well, because that's also, as the previous question came about, food versus non-food uses, and also just the mode of investment, because that's not necessarily investing in the production, that's investing in the value chain. But you still want to make sure that your investments are socially responsible, and that people are earning a decent wage. So it's quite an interesting one to investigate.
Thanks very much. Just as sort of a general question as well. You know, we're going through a huge food and nutrition crisis, you know, well, food security, nutrition security crisis globally, but obviously having a huge impact on emerging countries. Do you think in the situation we're in here, you know, do you think governments will start promoting aquaculture, aquabusiness, and give more subsidy within emerging countries? Is that not a trend that I'm saying I'm trying to promote? I want to put that on record. I just want to find out whether, as you run around or you're listening, do you think that's going to happen? Because the governments are coming to the World Bank, our clients, and asking us to give more support within the aquaculture space. This is one of the reasons why, of course, these guidelines are going to be critical from us. But I just want to hear from yourselves, you know, are you hearing that on the ground at all?
Yeah, if I could make a comment here, is I cannot speak obviously for the whole world, but in the southern, central, and eastern part, Eastern Africa, there is certainly an indication that governments see aquaculture as being one of the ways to increase protein for human consumption, and significantly so. Whether that is the same elsewhere in the world, well, we will find out. But certainly in southern, eastern, and central Africa, it is the case.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, we're moving into our last few minutes now. I've got some closing words, of course, but I just wanted to ask anyone from Advanced Africa, you know, is there anything you would like to say? I mean, I'm really amazed that we've got quite a global audience. I'm not sure, you know, you're on your presentation, you had your contact details. I'm not sure if you want to drop them in the chat so people can grab them quickly. and correspond with you, because I think there's a lot of knowledge within this webinar, from you guys and from others as well. So any closing words from Advance Africa, and then I'll wrap it up, particularly from Fred or Tom.
Well, I'd like to thank you once again, Chris, you, World Bank and ProBlue. It's an incredibly important exercise to go through. It's an incredibly important assignment for us, and it's been wonderful working with you guys so far, and I'm sure we're going to end up with a good result. So, and anybody who wishes to write to us, I think our contact details are available. More information we have, the more we can manage. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So sort of from my side, I want to say a special thanks, obviously, to all the people who've connected. Particularly want to shout out to Daniel. Actually, you've dropped some really good stuff in the in the chat. So thank you very much for that. I mean, we can have a look at those YouTubes and have a look through your portfolio and work there. I encourage everyone to interact. We're all on LinkedIn, connect with each other. We're trying to build a very, very strong Aquabusiness network. I'm being quite proud of the fact in the last year we have 120 people very strongly interested in seaweed that are connected to us. And I really got a big thirst for knowledge, some good opportunities, coming forward for investments. Obviously, a lot of seaweed investment, like 90% of seaweed is coming out of Asia. We're trying to influence that and trying to get more production, more investment across Africa. There's a lot of opportunity out there, so I'm very, very keen and interested in that area. So special thanks to everybody, particularly to the Advance Africa team, for all the work that's gone behind, to sort out this presentation and all the work you've done to date. Obviously, calling out to the audience as we develop these guidelines, please consider this, the first of a couple of webinars. We'll be looking into dissemination of the guidelines as well when they're prepared. So it'll be very interesting to hear what people think of the product at the end of the day. And we're going to be using that product, on World Bank Group investments, but also we will share it with a wider, development community, but we'll also be sharing it a lot with other banks as well, not just development banks, but also commercial banks. We're here to really influence the sector. We're here to influence investment in the sector. We want to show people that it is a strong, vibrant sector. In my research, aquaculture is the most valuable value chain. And it's something that, the World Bank has still got a lot of investment to do on the public sector. I think we're behind. A lot of the guidelines we've been setting up in the past are quite out of date in relation to new market requirements, biosecurity, technology, innovation. So watch this space. There'll be a lot going on. So thank you very much to everybody. So those are my final words. And also a special thanks to Ruth, my colleague, Ruth Garcia Gomez, who's really worked hard in bringing this whole thing together. So a special thanks to Ruth, and also to Vivek, who's actually hosted all the setup and running of the show. So thanks very much, and you'll see this posted on our website within the next 24 hours, and we'll be in touch. Thanks very much, everybody. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.